Peter Leon, just talk to us about the stakeholder declaration, just very briefly. What were the commitments and pledges made?
Well, this is a very important declaration, Lorato, signed last week, as you said, on the 30th of June, which is a culmination of a process which has actually been going on for about a year and a half, from late 2008 when the global financial crisis broke. Government, labour and business set up a thing called MIGDET, which is an acronym for the Mining Investment, Growth, Development and Transformation Task Team. And the Chamber of Mines, the unions and government became part of that. The thing, why it was initially established, was really to try and deal with issues of retrenchment in the mining industry. But in the last 6 months, government's focus has really been on regulatory issues in the mining industry, which has been particularly set off by our continually poor rankings in the Fraser Institute survey, which this year put South Africa in the bottom 10 of 72 mining countries which are surveyed every year. And the reason for that is the problems that there are with the licensing system, with the regulatory system, because all mining companies have to have licenses to operate, and mining companies also had to convert their mining rights and prospecting rights under the new Minerals Act. So there have been a lot of bottlenecks with that, and so one of the things this task team has addressed is the issue of the regulatory system, but it's also gone far beyond that, because this all happened at the same time that the Mining Charter Review, the government got going with that, and so many of the issues in this declaration deal with issues with which the Mining Charter deals with, but in greater detail.
Let's refer to this Mining Charter, because in it are complex issues around transformation, and the one thing that the Minister is not budging on is the question of equity in South African mines. The government's target is 26% black equity or ownership by the year 2014, and of all the compromises and concessions put forward, this is not one of them. Why is that?
Well, because I think that's become an absolutely critical issue to the Minister and to the government, that the 26% that was agreed in the Mining Charter shouldn't be deviated from. But obviously one of the issues is, to what extent mining companies have actually achieved the 15% that they were supposed to achieve by 2009, and can they actually achieve the 26% by 2014? The other real issue is, how is that 26% achieved? Because you might remember last year there was a huge controversy when the previous mining minister, literally days before the last election, put out mining codes of good practice, in terms of which all transactions had to be fully paid for within 2 years of their occurrence, which of course is unachievable. So what this document tries to do is, well, it's moved away from that. It said nothing about the mining codes, but what it does say is that beneficiaries in BE transactions should get some financial benefit from those transactions through trickle dividends. It also says, I think more controversially, that they should be given voting rights and should be treated as shareholders even if they're not shareholders.
I want to find out about those voting rights, because how much of an empowerment is that for the new entrants or the black shareholders coming into a mining entity, when you say we're going to help them access credit and we're going to improve on their voting rights?
Well, I mean, there's obviously an issue with the Companies Act. You can't make somebody a shareholder who isn't a shareholder, so you can be beneficiary, but you're not a shareholder and you don't have the right to attend general meetings of a company or shareholders meetings of a company. But this document basically says you do. So I mean, one of the issues I think the stakeholders, government, labour and business, are going to have to address when they flesh out this document in more detail is, how do you deal with that? But the declaration, obviously the issues of empowerment are very important, but where I think it makes a very significant impact is in relation to regulatory issues, things I've been concerned with. And there the document gives an undertaking that next year, 2011, the Mineral Petroleum Resources Development Act, our mining code, will be amended to make it more investor friendly. Well, that's the idea. And that these blockages, which Fraser Institute and others, me included, have been banging on about, will be addressed, and that we will have a more investor friendly mining industry. And I think that's important. I think it's also important the government, labour and business have got together for the first time in 8 years since the Mining Charter was signed in October 2002 and have come up with this document.
All right, to make the environment more investor friendly, you've still got to subscribe as an investor to the codes that exist in South Africa and the aspirations of this country. And again, transformation is a critical issue, but this time, controversy around employment equity and affirmative action. It is an issue that's been under discussion. It's an issue that the government is banging on about. How has the industry responded in the stakeholder declaration?
Well, that in a way surprised me. The industry has basically gone along with the other social partners, if you want to call them that, and agreed, unlike the mining charter where the targets for employment equity were very vague, this now says by 2014 there has to be 40% black management at every level of management, starting with the board of directors and then moving down the corporate chain to junior management. And that's a very, very ambitious undertaking given the shortage of skills we have in this country. So, but there was, I was involved in the discussions from February onwards, and there seemed to be less of a issue around that. There was much more of a debate about housing and living condition standards in the industry. The fact that you still have, unfortunately, hostels for mine workers. And there the document gives the mining companies until 2014 to achieve a move away from hostels and have single dwellings and units for mine workers.
Just before we bring Andrew into the conversation, the legacy issues that must be overcome, such as those hostels, also takes us to broader issues around why royalties and taxation issues haven't helped to empower local communities and appease communities in terms of minerals being their birthright. Why hasn't it worked well, with the exception of the Royal Buffer Gang?
Well, I think that's a huge problem, and you've seen the problem in areas where platinum mines exist, the problems that the platinum mining companies have had in the last couple of years. And I think the reason for that is that, with the exception of the Royal Buffer King, this has not been effectively addressed. Communities don't, unlike in other African mining jurisdictions, get the benefit of those royalties, because the royalties go into the national treasury and they're then redistributed through the tax system. Bear in mind the royalties have only existed since March 2010. I think that's an issue the government is going to have to address. It hasn't addressed it effectively. If you look at what's going on in West Africa, for example, in countries that have gone through a process of civil war, and Sierra Leone and Liberia and so on, those issues have been much more effectively addressed, where communities actually are given a stake in mining operations through some benefit from taxation or royalties or things like that. And I think that is an issue government is going to have to address in the next couple of years.
Right, okay. Andrew, your opinions here. I mean, mining, the viability of mining, and we spoke on other shows as well about prospects for mining, with the exception of platinum, because South Africa is the largest platinum producer. The gold mines is where a lot of these contentions come to the fore, and yet the industry outlook isn't particularly positive.
I think Peter quite eloquently explains the intricacies from a policy point of view. I think what interests me is, if you look at what Minister Shibangu said, I think it was last week, that we need to manage the branding of the industry. And I don't think that's the issue. I think it's policy and vagueness around policy that concerns investors. Peter mentioned the Fraser survey, which showed that we were sitting at number 61 out of 72 countries. What he didn't mention was a year prior to that we were at 48. And whether this has coincided with words like nationalization in the press, I don't know. But the reality is that the only two African countries below us are the DRC and Zimbabwe, and those are not the type of company counterparts we'd want to be associated with.
I mean, I looked at those rankings as well, and South Africa is not too far away from countries like Venezuela, for instance. And when Andrew mentions concerns raised about nationalization, the government insists it's not their policy, but it's an issue of debate within the ruling party, but it is not official government policy. Why do investors feel that that's blurring?
Quite frankly, I mean, Andrew's quite right. There's been too much double speak about this. You've had the president and the minister, to her credit, saying nationalisation is not the government's policy, but you have the ANC Youth League banging on about it all the time. And in fact, even the last week or two, there's been a standoff between Joel Nshatenzi and the Youth League, because he came out with you've seen it, a policy document in one of the ANC publications criticising the Youth League for putting nationalisation forward and saying this was a 50-year-old doctrine. The party had moved forward. President Mandela had abandoned nationalisation after he went to the World Economic Forum in 1992. All the correct things. And now the Youth League have accused him of being, ultra-conservative. And this was a major player in the Mbeki administration and indeed in the Zuma administration. I think there's too much noise around nationalisation, and there needs to be a lot less. And that, I think, does concern investors. The other point about the Fraser Institute survey is going back to 2002, we were midway on these rankings. We were 27 out of about 45 that were then being surveyed. But I mean, give the minister credit. She has accepted and said in her budget speech this year, the Fraser Institute report, we're doing very badly. By 2014, she wants South Africa to be in the top quartile, which is great.